There was a period in video game discourse when the term early access might as well have been a red cross painted on the developer's door, a social stigma defined by all the worst faith interpretations of how games were now being released to the market. Unfinished, rushed to meet sales targets, a weapon adopted by standalone grifters and callous corporations alike to extract as much out of the goodwill of a paying audience as they could get away with, and with no guarantee that the end result would, in fact, have a definitive end. Of course, this image is not a wholly accurate representation of what early access actually is. Yes, one could point to any number of failed projects over the years, so long as you were also happy to ignore the context behind why so many of them didn't quite make it to pasture. But even in its infancy, there was a healthy score of well-regarded games built through these means, and that has continued through to today. Titles like Kerbal Space Program, Slay the Spire, Hades, and, of course, the RPG mega-hit Baldur's Gate 3 have shown that good faith can be rewarded in lieu of or supplementary to traditional funding methods, with a greater insight into how an audience engages with your work and how to delicately balance creative intent with player desire. It is hard to move away from the anxiety of an uncertain future though, and for years I avoided this demarcation like the plague, waiting to see the end result of all that toil, if there would even be a finish line. I'd heard so many horror stories of projects stuck in limbo after a promising head start, or just never quite living up to expectations. Mismatched allocation of funds, design decisions made partway through that changed the way the game felt to play, poorly scoped roadmaps spread to breaking point by overly ambitious stretch goals, expectations reined in, stopping hyperbole dead in its tracks and leaving a bitter taste in many a player's mouths. Through all this, however, I need to admit something. I hadn't actually had any direct contact with any of these works at the point that they were still evolving, and for me that does feel like a bit of a problem. So easy it is to get caught in a vicious cycle of absorbing someone else's analytical canon, not taking the step to experience the thing with your own eyes and thus coming to your own conclusions. And speaking as someone whose main hobby I would argue is talking about the experience of play, it does feel a bit cheap that I was steering clear of a whole section of the wider games catalogue for no reason other than unfounded negative speculation. In more recent years, the winds have started to change. The general sentiment around early access has felt a lot more optimistic, and I kept reading with increasing frequency all these positive accounts of engagement with an in-progress development journey, including about games I did eventually get round to playing once they hit 1.0. It turns out Hades is pretty good, and I've spent dozens if not hundreds of hours in Slay the Spire over the years. It was time to break free of those self-imposed restrictions and get stuck into some fresh-faced and dewy-eyed new ideas. So I did. No longer the sign of the devil, I have met the early access moniker with curiosity rather than dread, and in this video I want to talk about 3 specific experiences I've had over the past year with games marked as still in development, and what I've learned about the system's strengths and weaknesses. Hyper Light Breaker released into early access on the 14th of January 2025. A long-awaited and decidedly unusual follow-up to the cult classic Hyper Light Drifter, this ambitious, procedurally generated open-world roguelike had been in development for years, a process I first became aware of thanks to the great documentation prowess of the team at NoClip. Heart Machine were building something unusual and unique, a constantly shifting expanse, filled to the brim with danger and tasking you with throwing yourself into the wild, seeking new weapons and upgrades to allow yourself to hold your own against those bigger threats on the horizon, and eventually building yourself up to be able to attack and dethrone the Abyss King in one final, brutal confrontation. Like its predecessor, Hyper Light Breaker is quite the challenge. A brutal combat roster requires split-second reaction times and a greater sense of spatial awareness and resource management to make it through even the most modest of encounters. Damage accumulates quickly and healing is Spartan at best. It's quite easy to die. Consequence arrives on your doorstep quickly, unceremoniously, but with a slightly different approach to permanence than usual. Although billed as a roguelike, death was not the end in the traditional sense. Should you fall to the perils of the wild, you were dumped back at base camp to regroup, refine, and return for another run at the same set of objectives and the same space to navigate, albeit from a different part of the map. Each generated world, however, had a finite number of attempts before the whole thing resets. It was an unusual middle ground, but one that was at least somewhat encouraging as a means of not immediately dashing your hopes for discovery of what lay beyond a particular horizon should you have gotten caught up in a fatal skirmish along the journey, especially in those early hours while you were coming to terms with how Hyper Light Breaker worked and what the game's challenge expected of you. That delaying familiarity was a blessing. It was almost like a more transient version of a seeded run. This variable finitude is present throughout the game's systems and processes, with some aspects surviving defeat, specific materials allowing you to upgrade back at base before the next attempt. Weapons and armour, however, not so robust, and this is independent of success or failure, as the game also posits a degradation system in play also. The sturdier items might survive one unsuccessful run or so, but eventually, like almost everything else, it will become lost to you. What I find quite encouraging about this setup is that despite being able to unlock a roster of player character archetypes to change up certain playstyles by your own hand, a lot of your strategies out in the wilds of the overgrowth are wholly contingent on what you have access to on any given run. Blades and bullets have different speeds and weight to them, their relative power level at the beck and whim of the algorithm, and so there are a lot of variables to contend with even in a single run. Everything is fleeting except your skill. My time with Hyper Light Breaker has been brief, for a number of reasons. Partially it was due to it not running particularly well on my now quite old PC when it first launched. It's definitely better now. A lot of optimization work has been done in the 18 months since launch, but I'm still not all that comforted by just how loud my fans get when I load it up. I also found that a lot of the gameplay and user interface elements were quite scruffy and uncouth, which surprised me given how clean and precise both of these things were in Heart Machine's other games. It's certainly not unplayable, and very readable in the heat of combat, but I did struggle a lot with the readability of various icons, and there are a lot of icons to contend with. A more potent roadblock for me, however, was that it was an experience that, although perfectly affable solo, was designed with cooperation in mind. A 3-person party was front and center of the game's marketing, and just bombing around the expanses of the overgrowth for a few minutes will clock you onto how this has been built with multiple players in mind. Experiences like this almost always benefit from the joy of pissing around with a couple of mates anyway, and almost immediately I started to sense that I was missing something vital by not engaging with the game that way. All of this is to say that, as a means of gauging the success of an early access experience, this was not a particularly salient encounter, for reasons that were, admittedly, my own fault. Hyper Light Breaker had its fair share of updates in the months that followed launch, mostly quality of life assurances and some light but likely fundamental shifts to the parameters of certain abilities, mods and upgrades, but eventually more substantial experiences were added into the game. New enemy types and boss encounters, additional class paradigms for the player to explore and master, and subquests that added extra layers of micro-objectives to encourage and drip-feed new avenues for progression for the player and their party. All things that would benefit those who had dug deep into the game's systems and the road to victory over the Abyss King, and not really something I could judge on the merits of my own shamefully brief time with the game. Correspondence around these updates from the studio was regular and thorough up until a certain point, and then things went a bit silent. On the 22nd of December 2025, following multiple rounds of layoffs at Heart Machine, publisher Arc Games announced that there would be no further updates to Hyper Light Breaker for the foreseeable future, with the promise of a final update releasing in January, one that never materialized, and a vague watch this space for the game's future. Most people in the community are not optimistic. I'm inclined to follow suit. It's hard to properly gauge exactly what went on with Hyper Light Breaker, only that for one reason or another it was not the smash hit its publisher had hoped for. There were a few things that I believed made it difficult for the game to properly break out. The first was that it had very middling previews from a number of games media outlets, including critiques of its design, the unsatisfying progression loop, the world itself not being particularly interesting, especially when compared to the bespoke intricacies of its predecessor, and how frustrating the load times between runs became, where most roguelikes live and die on instant replayability. I think more prescient though, and an under-discussed element of how games ultimately live or die on the vine, was that the game's premise and design were eerily similar to that of Elden Ring Night Rain, a title that launched only a scant few months later, and due to having that more substantive brand recognition and the backing of a more stable, entrenched studio, absolutely dominated the conversation around this particular style of cooperative roguelike. Night Rain also launched fully formed and multi-platform, where Hyper Light Breaker had console development on the slate as part of its early access roadmap. The PC ecosystem is expansive and modular, but I feel like this game would have done a lot better had it been bolstered by a full console release alongside it. It feels instinctively like a sofa game to me. All of this, of course, requires funds, infrastructure, and a gold dust rare stake in the zeitgeist, and the game launching in progress amidst a sea of conversation-dominating titles that ended up sucking the air out of the room meant that the odds were stacked massively against it. I do feel bad, because Hyper Light Breaker, while far from perfect, has decent bones, and I do believe what was there on day one was feature complete, in the sense that you could have a satisfying experience getting to grips with the game's systems and challenges. Were I able to run it a bit more comfortably, and were I more of a multiplayer guy, I might have stuck with it a bit longer. It is the sort of game, however, that needs extensive attention, updates, and a clearly defined service model to maintain the enthusiasm of its potential user base, and so it was a case of right place, but unfortunately, wrong time. This is the gamble with any project, however. Good intentions so easily are steamrolled by environmental factors beyond any one person's control. Nothing about Heart Machine's previous output suggested that this would be the end result. Hyper Light Drifter was an extremely accomplished work, and their previous venture into 3D realms, Solar Ash, was a fascinatingly unique action platformer that laid the foundation for this more ambitious multiplayer effort. I can't feel too much buyer's remorse though, because I still have access to the game. The footage you're seeing here was recorded in the past week, in fact. In an era where live service projects get completely obliterated from existence the moment their sales projections and retention dips even a millimeter, to have ongoing development cease but the game still available, playable, and with moments aplenty to enjoy, that is a blessing. Even if it's not quite the pristine vision its creators intended it to eventually become. Ambition, I feel, should never be discouraged, but sometimes a reined-in scope works better for the longevity of a project. Such is the case for my next venture into early access, a weird and wonderful roguelike by the name of Cesto. A game of chance wrapped in a subversively strategic core. Considering its outlandish presentation, Cesto is a brilliantly understated experience. You're presented with a 4x4 grid. Each cell has a percentage chance attached to it. All you need to do is click a row and see what fate has in store for you. Maybe something good, maybe a bitter end. A smorgasbord of monsters, traps, treasures, and juicy, delicious strawberries lie in wait, where a combination of chance and a spot of tactical dentistry form the foundations of an experience that I have absolutely adored from the start. A simple premise, brought to life by layers of variation that shake up the formula in really interesting ways. The periodic offering of a range of chance-altering teeth allows you to increase your odds for survival, playing to your strengths or mitigating your weaknesses. An item shop gives you boons and opportunities to escape a violent end for an increasingly severe cost. Complications to the enemy's parameters mean that you cannot be complacent, because they often react to the choices you make and the consequences you land yourself in. Even in its infancy, with a single biome and a small handful of characters to pick from, I found myself enthralled by how bafflingly esoteric and yet intrinsically knowable it felt to play. You would think a game based around luck would feel deeply unsatisfying, if not entirely unfair, but there is something about how Cesto handles its central conceit and the way it invites the player to mess around with the formulas that makes it an enduring joy to attempt to cheat fate. Time and time again, what made Cesto such a compelling thing to return to in its early access state, outside of the satisfaction of those chance-based gauntlets, was that it offered up with each update more wrinkles to the formula that begged more questions than answers. Pieces of a flute found during dungeon runs, hidden parameters for each character that, once unlocked, often begged further inquisition, an egg requiring a warm place to hatch. I still don't know what the deal is with that one, and that excites me. Coupled with this is the inherent playfulness of the user interface, squishing bugs in the shop, sometimes offering up a monetary reward, that very same shopkeep being at the mercy of what I can only describe as a boinged nose, blindsiding him enough to allow you to swipe a crucial item without the requisite funds. Pay a coin to a monster for a useless piece of trivia. Click on a ghoul peering on the edge of your board for a few extra coins. The utility of these acts wasn't essential for surviving the ordeals of the dungeon, but it all added to the experience in ways that compelled me to seek out these small pleasures nonetheless. It became a bit of a ritual. Every few months I would see the update bar sneakily appear on my Steam client. I would know that something had been added to the game and I would dive right in. I don't read patch notes, so it was up to me to discover firsthand what had changed, what had been added, and whether the game was still something worth the continued investment in. It almost always was. Every update to Cesto over the past year has made the game stronger without taking away from the core principles that piqued my interest in the first place. It helped, of course, that the developers had a clear roadmap to what they wanted the game to be. An evenly spread drip of new biomes, characters, items, and encounters fill out an already impressively designed center of gravity, but it was the consistency and presentation of these updates that drew me in further. What works in Cesto's favor, and this is the case for a lot of the early access success stories over the years, is that its core design supports both modular and incremental approaches to updates. Because this is built to be repeated, that loop rewards the update cycle on both the player and the developer's sides. If you are seeing the game from start to finish regularly, you can grow attuned to how these updates change the nature of how it feels to play, and thus what works versus what does not. There is less of the drop-off that comes with a more linear experience, and although this is entirely anecdotal, I don't have any data to back it up, I feel like players engage more this way. Cesto entered 1.0 on the 10th of April this year with a substantial final update that required a full progress reset, but also rewarded us with this swanky opening animation and a full raft of mysteries and dangers to dive back into. A risky move for some, sure, and at first I was irked by how much I had to redo now, considering the strides I had already made with the game over the past year, but eventually I realised that a chance to start from scratch here is yet another opportunity to engage with that splendid core gameplay loop once more, now fine-tuned and fully updated. A great place for new players and long-standing investors to meet on fertile soil, resulting in a game that's perfect to keep on hand for when you have a spare 20 minutes or so. Cesto's success can be attributed to a number of things. Primarily, it's just a really great and unusual experience. A striking art style and a gameplay loop that is unlike anything else out there gave it the surprise market niche that so many clamour for. On top of this, its modest proposal and contained vision meant that it wasn't really competing for attention like many other projects were. It was its own thing, sitting neatly in its own ecosystem, and that, I feel, allowed it to blossom in the best possible way. In light of my previously less than stellar experience with early access, Cesto was, I guess, the game that properly opened the floodgates for me to engage with this setup a lot more willingly. When a game feels substantial enough already, posting tweaks and additions in unobtrusive ways results in a very different sense of place for that project, as compared to when something feels like it's missing the bigger picture. There still can be drama along the way with this format. Some design choices will rub certain fans the wrong way. There's a famous case of this during the development of Darkest Dungeon that always springs to mind. But it is important to reconcile with that primary tension that is found within the early access process, a creator's intent versus an audience's desire. When we engage with something like this, a lot of the work has already gone into the project before it's even revealed to the public. We aren't joining the developers from the ground floor, but rather halfway up the spire. This is what you're seeing with a game like Cesto or Hyper Light Breaker, where the journey isn't about foundations, but rather what you build upon them. This, to me, is early access at its best, a celebration of the design process while retaining a project's modesty. But what happens when you're not making a run-based game? It's clear that this model of addition and refinement works well within the loop-based structure of roguelikes and more arcadey video game genres, but what about games where there is a more carefully curated, intended journey? I think back to the process of how Baldur's Gate 3 was developed. That's a long game by all accounts, and one with a branching web of choices defining your journey throughout it. And also one where its conclusion wasn't readily available from the get-go. An entire third act, held at arm's length until the developers at Larian Studios were wholly satisfied with what it represented for the sum total of the artistic output for the project. Yet it remained a massively popular title in early access, with a thunderously enthusiastic player base that only grew bigger once it hit 1.0. I know that it's about the journey, not the destination, but this seemed like a massive leap of faith to me. And so I wondered, is there something to this process of working your way through an experience in increments and still retaining some enthusiasm for the wider release? It is with this in mind that I came to my most recent early access investment. Moves of the Diamond Hand is an expansive dice-based RPG by visionary artist Cosmo D, a title that has a far more ambitious sense of scope and scale than any of his previous works, and the first to make use of this early access process as a means of supporting the continued development of his grander vision for the Off-Peak series. I don't want to bog down this video with discussions about the game itself, as I'm intending to do more of a deep dive once it gets closer to 1.0, but I think this is an interesting example of how different developers utilize early access. In particular because there already seems to be an awful lot of game here, but the focus has been on width rather than length. At launch, 2 chapters are playable out of a planned 5. The first, an enclosed prologue for the wider systems and narrative hooks of the work, set in a smaller, denser environment. The second, a sprawling cityscape with multiple angles of pursuit and a slew of wild adventures. Right from the beginning, it's clear just how ambitious this work really is. Almost every interaction leads you down some form of ancillary rabbit hole, as even the simplest of tasks spirals out into weird encounters with the city's populace. Nothing is ever simple, but there is a joy to be found in the routes it tasks you to pursue in order to achieve your goals. At the time of writing, I'm trying to procure a sandwich for a technician whose help I need fixing the world's most evil Billy Bass, but to do so I need to play the cello for some carnivorous plants in order to harvest their ingredients. It's a weird game. It would be way worse if it wasn't. With a well-signposted roadmap readily available, there is a clear delineation of what is and isn't accessible right now. But also, within the game itself, you get notifications about what you can do right here and now, and what is to come. Periodically, you come across locations you don't have access to, either via locked doors or specifically demarcated barriers. Some quest lines explicitly highlight what isn't currently available to pursue. In any other game, it would be a little immersion breaking, but considering how odd everything is in Off-Peak City, the booming voice of the creator providing a guiding hand is just one more thing to be normalized. During the process of writing this section of the video, I reached the conclusion of my pursuits throughout this current build of the game. There is a definitive full stop that gives you permission to hop off for a bit and wait for the next chapter to release. The problem is, I couldn't tell you whether what is there right now feels like a full experience in itself, especially knowing that the game's additional chapters and conclusion won't be complete until next year at the earliest. It doesn't feel like an episodic game, but at the same time, I've not found absence a defining feature of my experience. If anything, I've found the scope a little overwhelming already. My quest log is rammed to the gills, I'm juggling multiple challenges in tandem, and it can be a little bit much at times how one quest can unfurl into a good half dozen other branches. Cosmo D's previous games were, for the most part, single-sitting affairs. In fact, during my time with Moves of the Diamond Hand, I revisited everything else he has made in an effort to consolidate my thoughts on the wider oeuvre, and there is a striking difference in how this latest venture, even in its unfinished state, feels to play compared to those earlier works. It's just a more ambitious project, and while I do have some concerns about the underlying systems of the game and how it handles obstacles, the quality of the writing is still there, the environments are thrilling to explore, and it's still so very clearly a Cosmo D game. Just a lot of one. Even in the opening section, whereby you are locked in a train station pending the investigation of stolen goods, you have almost as much to do here as the entirety of Cosmo D's previous game Betrayal at Club Low, and the systems have only gotten more complex and cumbersome in the hours since. It's generous for what it is right now, in the early stages of an early access roadmap that promises more areas to explore, new mechanics introduced, quest lines fleshed out, and a healthy handful of quality of life improvements along the way. This is a really exciting thing to get involved with, and I genuinely believe that getting in on the ground floor will give me a heightened appreciation and a better analytical context for when I properly review the full game at some point down the line. Early access is going to be a lot of things to a lot of people, and I think the state of where it is in 2026 is not actually that far removed from those tumultuous early days. Although the tools for development have never been more widely available, the process of making games, and crucially making good games, remains a furtive and laborious task, and certainly one with its fair share of perils when it comes to the sustainability of practice. Life gets in the way. People will let you down. Ambition engulfs reliability so easily that you can be neck deep in the quagmire before realizing that you don't actually know how to get out. What I feel has changed in the intervening years, however, is me. I play games differently now compared to even a decade ago. I dabble in a lot of different things. I sometimes don't finish games that I've loved every second of. I have a 3/4 done playthrough of Citizen Sleeper 2 that I haven't touched in over a year for no reason other than something else has caught my attention. A game launching in a semi-finished state, to me, is no longer a burden or a letdown. I'm even eyeing up some of those abandoned projects, including my own personal white whale, Consortium the Tower, a follow-up to an interesting narrative immersive sim from 2014 that's been in development hell for nearly 10 years. Now that I feel okay with playing something that might never reach its ideal intended state, I am open to the idea of the idea, independent of its execution. I think developers have also grown more wise to the stigma and expectation around early access, burdened by the reputation of unsuccessful ventures and perhaps more so by that of the high-profile heavy hitters. To create something in tandem with an audience's direct engagement is a nervous proposition, and the type of audience matters. Feedback is part of the process. An artist's instinct is only one part of the equation, and sometimes it does take another pair of eyes to see the vital stepping stones on the journey towards that final vision, but it is equally important to recognize that these processes aren't all suitable for every kind of creative work. That balance is delicate, the context behind the work matters, and sometimes both the creator and their potential audience need to take a leap of faith. Thank you for watching. I appreciate that this is a bit of a different subject for me to tackle than normal, but early access is such an intriguing wrinkle in the experience of engaging with games now that I feel like I had to consolidate my thoughts on it, even if those thoughts were essentially, yeah, it works sometimes. What I want to know now, though, is what your early access experiences have been like, and whether you consider that moniker a nervous proposition or a beacon of hope for the future. Let me know in the comments. As always, a special thank you to my patrons, the Rasta Rascals, and I'll see you next time.